My foster parents thought they could isolate me from my siblings and make me forget them, but they didn't realize we had a secret phone. I was standing in the Morgans' pristine kitchen at 11:30 at night, holding a burner phone I'd hidden inside a hollowed-out dictionary, when Diane Morgan walked in and flipped on the light. I'd been texting my little sister Chloe, telling her everything was going to be okay, even though I had no idea if that was true, when I heard the footsteps on the stairs. My hands went numb, and the phone slipped, clattering onto the marble countertop. Diane's face went from confusion to rage in about 2 seconds flat. She grabbed my wrist so hard I felt something pop and said in this terrifyingly calm voice that we needed to have a conversation about trust and loyalty. I watched her pick up the phone with her other hand, scrolling through months of messages between me and my siblings, her mouth getting tighter with each swipe. She finally looked up at me and said I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life, that she was going to make sure I never saw Chloe or my brother again. I'd been in foster care for 8 months when the Morgans first showed interest in fostering me. My mom died in a car accident when I was 14, and my dad had never been in the picture, so me and my 2 younger siblings got thrown into the system. Chloe was 11, and my brother Ethan was 9. They placed us together initially at an emergency shelter, then moved us to a group home in the next county. The social worker, a tired woman named Beverly Kent, who'd been doing this job for 19 years, told us they were trying to find a family who could take all 3 of us. She said it might take a while because most people didn't want 3 kids at once, especially teenagers. I told her we'd wait as long as it took because we were staying together no matter what. The Morgans seemed perfect at first. Richard was a dentist who owned his own practice, and Diane ran some kind of consulting business from home. They had this massive house in the suburbs with a pool and a 3-car garage. They'd been foster parents before, successfully placing 2 kids in permanent adoptive homes over the past decade. When they met me at the social worker's office, they were warm and asked thoughtful questions about my interests in school. Diane said they'd love to have me stay with them while Beverly continued looking for a family that could take all 3 of us. Richard said their home had plenty of space, and they believed in giving kids a stable environment during difficult transitions. I was hesitant about being separated from Chloe and Ethan, but Beverly said it was just temporary, maybe a month or 2, and I could visit my siblings every weekend at the group home. The first week at the Morgans' house was fine. They gave me my own room with new furniture and a laptop for schoolwork. Diane made home-cooked meals every night, and Richard helped me with my algebra homework. They took me shopping for clothes and didn't make me feel bad about needing things. When Saturday came, I asked what time we'd be heading to see Chloe and Ethan. Diane got this weird expression and said Beverly had called to reschedule the visit because the group home had a lice outbreak. She showed me a text from Beverly confirming it. I was disappointed but understood. Kids in group homes got lice all the time from sharing brushes and pillows. The next weekend, there was a different excuse. The group home van broke down so they couldn't bring Chloe and Ethan to meet us halfway like planned. The weekend after that, Ethan supposedly had a stomach bug. Then Chloe had a school project. Then there was a staffing shortage at the group home. By week 6, I'd seen my siblings exactly 0 times since moving in with the Morgans. I started asking Beverly directly when I could visit, and she'd give me vague answers about scheduling conflicts and logistics. Something felt off, but I couldn't pinpoint what. The Morgans acted like they wanted to help me maintain contact with my siblings, always seeming disappointed when visits fell through, always suggesting we'd try again next week. Around week 7, I noticed Diane and Richard started talking about adoption. Not directly to me at first, just between themselves when they thought I wasn't listening. I'd hear fragments of conversations about home studies and court dates and finalizing paperwork. One night at dinner, Richard asked how I was adjusting and if I could see myself being part of their family long term. I said I appreciated everything they were doing, but my family was Chloe and Ethan, and whatever happened, we needed to stay together. Diane's smile got tight, and she said of course, they understood how important sibling bonds were, but she also said I needed to be realistic about the chances of finding a family willing to take 3 kids, especially with me being a teenager. She said sometimes loving your siblings meant wanting what was best for them, even if that meant being in different homes. I started getting this sick feeling in my stomach every time they brought it up. The way they talked about my siblings changed too. Instead of asking about them or encouraging me to call them, they'd make little comments about how difficult it must have been for me to essentially parent 2 younger kids after our mom died. They'd say, I deserved to just be a teenager, to not have so much responsibility. Richard said something about how trauma bonding wasn't the same as healthy family attachment. I didn't know what that meant, but it sounded like something a therapist might say. When I pushed back and said Chloe and Ethan weren't burdens, they'd agree quickly and change the subject. But the message was clear. They wanted me without my siblings. Week 9 brought a turning point. I was at school when I got called to the counselor's office. Beverly was there with another social worker I'd never met, a younger guy named Thomas Reeves who worked in the adoption unit. They sat me down and said they'd been working really hard to find a placement for all 3 of us, but it wasn't looking promising. Thomas said in his 12 years of social work, he'd placed maybe 5 sibling groups of 3 or more, and those were usually younger kids. He said the reality was that I might age out of foster care before they found someone willing to take all of us. Beverly said the Morgans had expressed serious interest in adopting me specifically. She said they'd completed their home study and had an excellent track record. She asked how I felt about that possibility. I told them absolutely not. I said I'd rather stay in the group home with Chloe and Ethan than get adopted without them. Thomas got this patronizing look and said I needed to think about my future, about having a stable home and family support for college. Beverly said the group home couldn't keep me forever, that they needed the beds for emergency placements. She said if I didn't seriously consider the Morgans' offer, I might end up in a less ideal situation. I asked what would happen to Chloe and Ethan if I got adopted. Thomas said they'd continue looking for placements for them, either together or separately, depending on what became available. I said no again, louder this time. Beverly sighed and said we'd revisit the conversation later, that I didn't need to make any decisions today. That night, I tried calling the group home to talk to Chloe. The staff said she was in bed already even though it was only 8:30. I asked to leave a message and they said they'd pass it along. I tried again the next night and got told Chloe was at a recreational activity. The third night, the staff member who answered said they'd been instructed to limit my phone contact with the residents per request from my social worker. I felt my chest get tight. I asked what that meant, and she said she couldn't discuss case details with me, that I needed to talk to Beverly. I called Beverly immediately and got her voicemail. I left a message asking why I couldn't talk to my own sister. She called back 2 days later and said there'd been some miscommunication, that of course I could talk to Chloe, but they were trying to help all of us adjust to our current placements, and sometimes too much contact made the transition harder. I knew something was wrong. Really wrong. The Morgans were controlling my access to my siblings, probably with Beverly's help. I didn't have proof, just this gut certainty that they were systematically cutting me off from Chloe and Ethan, so I'd forget about them and agree to be adopted. I started paying closer attention to everything. The Morgans had my school schedule, my therapist appointments, my entire life documented in a binder Diane kept in her home office. I saw notes in the margins about building attachment and reducing external family ties. There was an email chain between Diane and Beverly discussing strategies for helping me accept that reunification with my siblings might not happen. The clinical language made me want to throw up. They were treating my family like an obstacle to overcome. I needed a way to communicate with Chloe and Ethan without the Morgans or Beverly knowing. The Morgans monitored my laptop and had parental controls on my phone that let them see every call and text. I couldn't use school computers because they blocked most messaging apps and teachers could see the screens. I started thinking about how kids in my situation stayed connected and remembered a story I'd heard about foster kids using prepaid phones. I had about $80 saved from before my mom died, money I'd kept hidden in my backpack. I researched burner phones and found you could get a basic one at convenience stores for around $30 with a prepaid plan. Getting the phone was harder than I expected. The Morgans drove me everywhere and I couldn't just disappear to a store without questions. I waited until a Saturday when Richard took me to the library for a school project. I told him I needed a couple of hours to research and he said he'd run errands and pick me up at 4. The second his car pulled away, I walked 3 blocks to a drugstore and bought the cheapest phone they had. The cashier barely looked at me, just scanned the phone and the prepaid card I grabbed. I activated it in the bathroom using the instructions on the package, my hands shaking the whole time. I had no idea if this would even work, if the group home would let Chloe talk to me on an unknown number, but I had to try. I called the group home that afternoon from a corner behind the library stacks. The same staff member who'd told me about the contact restrictions answered. I disguised my voice slightly and said I was Chloe's cousin calling to check on her. The woman hesitated, then said she'd get Chloe. 2 minutes later, my sister's voice came through the phone, small and scared. She said my name like a question and I said, "Yeah, it's me. Don't say anything about this phone to anyone." Chloe started crying immediately. She said she thought I'd forgotten about them, that the social worker told her I was doing really well in my new home and might not have time to visit anymore. I felt rage build in my chest so intense I had to sit down. I told her that was a lie, that I'd been trying to see her every single weekend, that someone was keeping us apart on purpose. Chloe said she and Ethan were scared because Beverly kept talking about finding them separate placements. She said a family came to meet Ethan last week, just him, and afterward he cried for hours because he didn't want to leave without us. I asked if she could keep this phone number somewhere safe and call me when staff wasn't around. She said she'd hide it in her notebook and call from the payphone in the group home hallway when she had rec time. We talked for 20 minutes about everything. School, friends, whether she was eating okay. Normal sibling stuff that shouldn't have felt like an act of rebellion but did. Before hanging up, I told her I was going to fix this, that I was going to figure out how to keep us together. She said she believed me, and it broke my heart because I wasn't sure I believed myself. I hid the phone inside a hollowed-out dictionary I'd made by carefully cutting pages out of an old textbook I found at a thrift store. It was paranoid, but the Morgans went through my room regularly, under the guise of cleaning and helping me stay organized. I kept the dictionary on my bookshelf between other textbooks, betting they wouldn't think twice about it. For the next 3 weeks, Chloe and I texted almost every night after the Morgans went to bed. I'd sneak down to the kitchen or bathroom with the phone tucked in my pocket and we'd message back and forth. She'd tell me about her day, about Ethan struggling in math, about the new girl at the group home who cried every night. I'd tell her I was working on a plan to get us back together, even though I had no idea what that plan actually was. Ethan started using the phone too. Chloe gave him the number, and he'd call from the same payphone, usually on weekends. His voice sounded older every time I talked to him, like he was growing up too fast without me there. He said he missed me and asked when I was coming to get them. I told him soon, even though I didn't know if that was true. The lies I was telling my siblings to keep their hope alive were destroying me, but the alternative was worse. I couldn't let them think I'd abandoned them like everyone kept suggesting I should. The Morgans escalated their adoption push in month 4. They sat me down for what they called a family meeting and presented a photo album of the 3 of us together at various outings over the past few months. There were pictures from a baseball game, a museum trip, the dentist office where Richard worked. Diane had written captions like, "Our growing family," and "Making memories together." It felt staged and manipulative. Richard said they'd started official adoption proceedings and wanted me to know how much I meant to them. Diane said they'd already picked out college savings accounts in my name and were planning to add me to their life insurance policies. They were trying to make me feel guilty for not wanting what they were offering. I asked point blank if they'd consider adopting Chloe and Ethan too. The silence stretched out long enough to be uncomfortable. Richard said they'd thought about it extensively, but their financial situation and home setup were really designed for one child. He said 3 kids would strain their resources, and they wanted to give me the best possible future. Diane said she'd spoken extensively with Beverly about what was best for everyone involved, and the consensus was that I'd thrive in their home, while Chloe and Ethan would likely find placements better suited to their ages and needs. I realized then that this had been the plan all along. They'd never intended to keep us together. They'd chosen me specifically because I was older and less work, and they'd been working with Beverly to manufacture reasons why splitting us up was somehow good for everyone. I started documenting everything. I'd screenshot conversations with Chloe and Ethan on the burner phone and email them to a throwaway account I'd created. I took photos of the notes in Diane's binder when she left her office unlocked. I recorded conversations with Beverly where she'd push the adoption angle and minimize my siblings' importance. I didn't know what I was going to do with the evidence, but I knew I needed it. My mom had always said that when dealing with powerful people, you needed proof of everything because they'd rewrite history to make themselves look good. The Morgans had money and connections and a spotless reputation as foster parents. I was a traumatized teenager with no power and no resources. Documentation was the only weapon I had. The crisis hit in month 5. I came home from school to find Beverly and another social worker sitting in the living room with the Morgans. The other social worker introduced herself as Linda Carver, a supervisor with 18 years of experience in child welfare. She said they needed to discuss my case plan and my future. Beverly said Chloe and Ethan had both received placement offers. A family in the next state wanted to adopt Ethan, and a couple in our county was interested in fostering Chloe with the possibility of adoption. Linda said these were excellent matches that met both kids' needs for stability and permanence. She said the families were ready to move forward quickly, potentially having both kids placed within 3 weeks. I felt like the floor dropped out from under me. I said we'd agreed they'd keep looking for someone who'd take all 3 of us. Beverly said they'd looked extensively, that after 5 months it was clear that placement wasn't going to materialize. She said I needed to accept that my siblings would be better off in homes specifically chosen for them, rather than waiting indefinitely for something that might never happen. Linda said the Morgans were ready to finalize my adoption and provide me with a loving, permanent home. She made it sound like I was being selfish for not wanting my siblings to have the same thing. I asked if Chloe and Ethan knew about these placements, and Beverly said they were going to tell them this week, after they got my input and cooperation. I said no. Absolutely not. I said I'd rather go back to the group home than let them split us up. Richard looked at Beverly and said he'd warned her I might react this way. Diane said they understood I was upset, but I needed to think rationally about what was best for everyone. Linda said I was a minor and didn't have legal authority to block placements that were in my siblings' best interests. I asked who decided what was in their best interests, and she said the department did, based on professional assessments and available resources. I said this was bullshit and walked out of the room before they could stop me. I heard Diane tell Beverly that I was having trouble with attachment and emotional regulation lately, probably trauma responses, and they'd been working with me in therapy. That night, I called Chloe from my hiding spot in the bathroom. I told her what happened, and she started sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. She said she didn't want to go to another family without me and Ethan, that she'd run away if they tried to make her. I told her not to do anything that would get her in trouble, that I was going to figure something out. She said the social worker had already shown her a picture of the couple who wanted to foster her. They seemed nice, but they weren't us. They weren't family. Ethan got on the phone and asked if what Chloe was saying was true, if they were really going to send him away. His voice cracked, and he sounded so young. I told him I loved him, and I wasn't going to let this happen. He said he trusted me, but he was scared. After I hung up, I sat on the bathroom floor for an hour, trying to figure out my next move. I needed help from someone outside the system. The Morgans controlled Beverly, and Beverly controlled access to my siblings. I couldn't fight them alone. I started researching child advocacy organizations and found the Children's Rights Coalition, a nonprofit that provided free legal services to foster kids. Their website said they specialized in cases involving sibling separation and wrongful adoption proceedings. I filled out their online intake form at school, explaining the whole situation. 2 days later, a lawyer named Veronica Stiles called me during lunch period. She had 14 years of experience in juvenile law and said my case raised several red flags about potential violations of sibling placement preferences. Veronica asked if I had any documentation of the Morgans or social workers trying to separate me from my siblings. I told her about the notes in Diane's binder, the emails, the recorded calls with Beverly. She said that was good, that was helpful, but she needed me to gather as much as possible before they moved forward with the placements. She explained that family court judges were supposed to prioritize keeping siblings together unless there were compelling reasons to separate them. The fact that no one had documented why separating us was necessary could work in our favor. She said she'd file an emergency motion to stop the placements, but she needed at least 72 hours to build a case. I told her I'd get her everything I had. That weekend, I snuck into Diane's office while she and Richard were at a dental conference. I photographed every page of her binder and every email I could find on her computer discussing my case. Some of the emails were shocking. In one thread, Diane told Beverly that I was becoming too attached to my siblings and they needed to reduce contact to help me bond with their family instead. Beverly responded agreeing and suggesting they frame it as helping all 3 kids adjust to their new realities. Another email from Richard to an adoption attorney discussed strategies for finalizing my adoption, even if I initially resisted. The attorney wrote back saying that at 15, my preferences would be considered but weren't legally binding if the court determined the adoption was in my best interest. I uploaded everything to a cloud drive and sent the link to Veronica. She called me that night, sounding angry on my behalf. She said what the Morgans and Beverly had done was ethically questionable at minimum and possibly illegal depending on how much they'd misrepresented the situation to the court. She said she'd file the emergency motion first thing Monday morning. She warned me that the Morgans might retaliate when they found out, that I should be prepared for them to restrict my movements or try to limit my contact with her office. I said I understood. I'd been prepared for things to get worse since the moment I bought that burner phone. Monday afternoon, Beverly showed up at school and pulled me out of class. She looked furious. She said I'd gone behind her back to hire a lawyer and file motions without discussing it with her or my foster parents. I said I didn't need their permission to get legal representation. She said what I'd done was disrespectful and showed a lack of trust in the people trying to help me. I said maybe if they'd actually tried to keep my family together instead of splitting us up for their convenience, I wouldn't have needed a lawyer. She said I was making this much harder than it needed to be, that the placements for Chloe and Ethan were good ones, and I was being selfish by blocking them. I told her the judge would decide that, not her. The Morgans were waiting when I got home. They'd moved everything out of my room except the bed and a change of clothes. Diane said since I'd shown I couldn't be trusted, they were implementing new rules for my safety and theirs. No phone, no laptop, no unsupervised time. Richard said they were disappointed I'd gone to an outside lawyer instead of talking to them about my concerns. He said it showed I didn't value the relationship they'd built with me. I said the only relationship they wanted was one where I abandoned my siblings and pretended to be their grateful replacement child. Diane's face went cold, and she said I could think about my attitude in my room for the rest of the night. I spent that evening lying on my bed, trying to figure out how I was going to communicate with Veronica or my siblings without my phone. Then I remembered the burner was still hidden in the dictionary. The Morgans had taken my smartphone and laptop, but they didn't know about the secret phone. I waited until midnight, then crept downstairs to the kitchen with the dictionary under my arm. I texted Chloe that things were getting worse, but I had a lawyer now who was fighting for us. She wrote back asking if we were going to be okay. I told her I didn't know, but I wasn't giving up. That's when Diane walked in and caught me. The look on her face when she saw the phone was pure rage mixed with something else. Betrayal, maybe, or fear that I'd outsmarted them. She grabbed my wrist and twisted it until I dropped the phone, then picked it up and started scrolling through months of messages with my siblings. Every secret conversation, every plan to stay together, every expression of love and loyalty that proved I hadn't forgotten them like she'd hoped. Her hands shook as she read, and I watched her realize that everything she'd been telling Beverly and the court about me bonding with their family and accepting the separation was a lie. I'd been fighting them the whole time, documenting their manipulation, building a case against them. She looked at me with such hatred that I actually stepped back. She said I'd destroyed any chance of this adoption going through, that no judge would approve it now that I'd shown I was willing to deceive them and go behind their backs. She said she was calling Beverly first thing in the morning to request my immediate removal from their home. Richard appeared in the doorway, asked what was happening. Diane showed him the phone and explained. He looked disappointed but not surprised, like he'd known all along I was too loyal to my siblings to ever really be theirs. He said they'd tried their best with me, but some kids were too damaged to accept help. That word damaged hit me like a punch. Hit me. I wasn't damaged. I was just a kid who loved his family and refused to let anyone take them away. Beverly showed up the next morning with a police officer. She said the Morgans had requested emergency removal based on my deceptive behavior and their concerns for household safety. I asked what safety concerns, and she said hiding contraband communication devices and going behind their backs to lawyers constituted a breakdown of trust that made the placement untenable. The cop, a bored-looking guy named Officer Daniels, asked if I'd come peacefully or if we needed to do this the hard way. I grabbed my backpack with the few things the Morgans hadn't confiscated and followed them out. Diane watched from the doorway with her arms crossed. Richard didn't even come out to say goodbye. 4.5 months of pretending to care about me, gone the second I proved I wouldn't abandon my siblings for them. Beverly drove me to a different group home across town. She didn't speak the entire drive except to say I'd made things very difficult for everyone and there would be consequences for my choices. I said the only consequence I cared about was whether the judge would stop Chloe and Ethan's placements. She said Veronica's emergency motion had delayed things temporarily, but the department was fighting it, and she was confident the placements would move forward once the court saw the full picture. I said the full picture included emails proving she and the Morgans conspired to separate us. Beverly's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. The new group home was grittier than the last one, overcrowded, understaffed, with that institutional smell of industrial cleaner and sadness. The house manager, a tired woman named Ruth Paulson, who'd been doing this for 23 years, showed me to a room I'd share with 2 other boys. She said mealtimes were strict, chores were mandatory, and I had a curfew. She also said I had a court date in 5 days for the emergency hearing about my siblings' placements. Veronica had gotten it expedited based on the urgency of the situation. Ruth said a van would take me to the courthouse and I should dress appropriately. I asked if Chloe and Ethan would be there, and she said probably, since the hearing concerned their placements too. I called Veronica from the group home payphone that night, using calling card minutes Ruth had given me. Veronica said the Morgans and Beverly had filed counter motions claiming I was emotionally disturbed and my opposition to the placement stemmed from unhealthy attachment rather than genuine sibling bonds. They'd submitted therapy notes from sessions I'd had with a counselor the Morgans had taken me to, notes that characterized me as having difficulty accepting change and forming new attachments. Veronica said she'd reviewed the notes, and they were clearly slanted to support the adoption narrative. She said we had strong evidence of manipulation, but family court judges had a lot of discretion, and we needed to be prepared for the possibility they'd rule against us. The 5 days before the hearing were the longest of my life. I couldn't sleep, could barely eat. The other kids at the group home mostly left me alone, sensing I wasn't in the mood to socialize. I spent hours crafting a statement for the judge, explaining why keeping us together mattered, why what the Morgans and Beverly did was wrong. Veronica said I'd have a chance to speak if I wanted to, but she warned me that judges sometimes didn't listen to kids my age the way they should. She said the fact that I was 15 worked against me because the system saw me as almost aged out anyway, not a priority for family placement. I told her I didn't care about being a priority. I just cared about my siblings not getting shipped off to strangers while everyone pretended it was for their own good. The morning of the hearing, I put on the one dress shirt I owned and the khakis Ruth had found in the donation closet. I looked like I was going to a funeral, which felt appropriate. The van picked me up at 8 and drove to the county courthouse. Veronica met me outside, carrying a briefcase stuffed with evidence. She said Beverly, the Morgans, and representatives from the potential placement families would all be there. She said Chloe and Ethan were coming too, with their own advocate appointed by the court. I asked if I'd get to see them, and she said probably not before the hearing, but maybe after, depending on how things went. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with fluorescent lights and wooden benches that looked like church pews. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Hammond, who'd been on the family court bench for 21 years. She had a reputation for being tough, but fair, according to Veronica. Beverly sat at one table with the county attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Kevin Lloyd, who'd been prosecuting these cases for 9 years. The Morgans sat behind them, Diane looking composed and Richard checking his phone. At another table sat the advocates for the placement families, and in the back row I finally saw them. Chloe and Ethan, sitting with a woman I didn't recognize who must have been their court-appointed advocate. Chloe saw me and her face lit up. Ethan waved. I waved back and felt my throat get tight. Judge Hammond called the hearing to order and asked for opening statements. Kevin Lloyd went first, arguing that the department had conducted thorough assessments and determined that separate placements for each child would best meet their individual needs. He said I was being allowed to voice my opinion, but my age and the realities of the foster system meant that my preferences couldn't override professional judgments about my siblings' welfare. He said the families waiting to adopt Chloe and Ethan were excellent matches who'd been thoroughly vetted, and delaying these placements was harmful to the children who deserved permanent homes. Veronica stood up and methodically destroyed his argument. She presented the emails between Diane and Beverly, discussing strategies to reduce my contact with my siblings. She showed the judge notes from Diane's binder about breaking family attachments. She played audio recordings of Beverly telling me I needed to forget about Chloe and Ethan for my own good. She presented testimony from the group home staff who said Chloe and Ethan had both expressed strong desires to stay with me and had shown distress when told they might be separated. She argued that state law required sibling groups to be kept together unless there were compelling documented reasons for separation, and that no such documentation existed here. The only reason being given was convenience and the Morgans' preference to adopt only me. Judge Hammond listened to everything without interrupting. When Veronica finished, the judge asked Beverly directly why no efforts had been made to find a placement for all 3 children together. Beverly stammered something about limited resources and the reality of the foster system. Judge Hammond asked if she'd actually tried to find a family for all 3 of us, or if she'd focused on splitting us up from the beginning. Beverly admitted she'd prioritized finding individual placements because she felt that was more realistic. The judge asked why she'd restricted my contact with my siblings if the goal was genuinely their well-being. Beverly said it was to help everyone adjust to their situations. Judge Hammond said it sounded more like it was to make me easier to adopt without the complication of siblings. Then the judge did something I didn't expect. She asked to speak to Chloe and Ethan individually in her chambers. The court advocate brought them forward, and they disappeared through a side door with the judge. They were gone for 20 minutes. When they came back, Chloe had been crying, and Ethan looked scared. Judge Hammond returned to the bench and said she'd heard directly from both children about their wishes to remain with their brother and each other. She said their statements were clear, consistent, and heartfelt. She said after reviewing all the evidence, she was troubled by the pattern of behavior from both the foster parents and the social worker that suggested prioritizing an adoption over sibling welfare. Judge Hammond ruled that the placements for Chloe and Ethan were denied. She ordered the department to conduct a new search for a family willing to take all three of us, and if none could be found within 90 days, to explore other options including kinship placement or legal guardianship with me as guardian once I turned 18. She said Beverly was to be removed from our case immediately and a new social worker assigned. She said the Morgans' adoption petition for me was denied and they were to have no further contact with any of us. She said she was referring the case to the department's ethics board for review of Beverly's conduct. The courtroom was silent for a moment. Then Chloe burst into tears. Happy tears this time. Beverly looked like she'd been slapped. The Morgans stood up and walked out without looking at anyone. Kevin Lloyd gathered his papers with tight movements that suggested he was furious about losing. Veronica smiled at me and said we'd done it. We'd actually won. The court advocate brought Chloe and Ethan over to me, and we hugged for the first time in 5 months. Chloe buried her face in my shoulder and said she knew I'd figure it out. She knew I wouldn't let them take her away. Ethan held on to both of us and said he'd been so scared but now everything was okay. I told them it would be okay, that we were staying together no matter what happened next. The department assigned us a new social worker named Jeffrey Paul, who'd been working in reunification services for 16 years. He seemed genuinely committed to finding us a placement together. Within 3 weeks, he'd located a couple in the next county who'd been licensed foster parents for 8 years and had specifically requested sibling groups. Their names were Linda and Michael Torres, and they had a farmhouse with enough room for all of us. We met them at a neutral location first, just to see if we'd be compatible. They were kind and asked us what we needed to feel safe and comfortable. Linda said they believed siblings should stay together, and that's why they'd told Jeffrey they'd only accept placements of multiple kids. Michael said they'd raised 3 biological children who were now adults, and they wanted to use their empty nest to help families like ours stay intact. We moved in with the Torres family in July. They gave us each our own room, but said we could arrange things however we wanted. Chloe wanted to share with me at first because she had nightmares, and the Torres said that was fine, whatever made her feel safe. Ethan struggled with school after missing so much while stressed about the placement situation, and Michael sat with him every night helping with homework. They never made us call them Mom and Dad, said we could use their first names or come up with our own names for them when we felt ready. They took us to therapy, both individual and family sessions, to help us process the trauma of almost being separated. 6 months later, Jeffrey came by for a regular check-in. He said the ethics board had completed their investigation of Beverly's conduct. She'd been suspended for 6 months without pay and required to complete additional training on sibling placement policies. The Morgans had withdrawn from the foster parent program entirely after the ethics board opened a separate investigation into their practices. Jeffrey said 3 other foster children who'd been with the Morgans in previous years had come forward with similar stories about being pressured to cut ties with siblings or biological family. The state was reviewing all of their past placements for potential violations. I never heard from the Morgans again. Diane deleted all the photos from that family album she'd made. Richard apparently sold his dental practice and moved to a different state. I didn't care what happened to them, as long as they stayed away from us. Veronica called sometimes to check on how we were doing. She said our case had led to policy changes in the county about sibling placements and documentation requirements. She said maybe some good had come from what we'd been through, that maybe other kids wouldn't have to fight as hard to stay with their siblings. The Torres family kept us for 2 years, all the way until I turned 18. By then, Chloe was 13 and Ethan was 11. Linda and Michael asked if we wanted to make the arrangement permanent through adoption, but I said no. Not because they weren't good to us, but because I didn't want to replace our mom like that. They understood. Instead, they helped me file for legal guardianship of my siblings once I became an adult. The court approved it based on our stability with the Torres family and their willingness to continue supporting us. We stayed living with Linda and Michael while I finished high school and started community college, but legally, I was Chloe and Ethan's guardian. That burner phone, I kept it. Never turned it on again, but I couldn't throw it away either. It was proof that even when the system tried to erase our family, we'd found a way to hold on to each other. The dictionary I'd hollowed out sits on my bookshelf now, a reminder that sometimes you have to get creative to protect the people you love. Chloe asks about it sometimes, why I keep a destroyed textbook. I tell her it's a souvenir from the worst and best time of my life. Worst because of what the Morgans and Beverly tried to do to us. Best because it was when I learned I'd fight anyone and anything to keep my family together. Looking back, I realize how close we came to losing each other. If I hadn't bought that phone, if I hadn't documented everything, if I hadn't found Veronica, the Morgans would have adopted me and Chloe, and Ethan would be living with strangers in different cities right now. We'd be calling other people our family and wondering what happened to each other. The system almost won, almost convinced me that being split up was inevitable, that I should accept it for everyone's sake. But that phone, those secret conversations, they kept us connected just long enough for me to fight back. The Torres family moved to Florida last year after Michael retired. We still talk every week. They send care packages and visit during holidays. Linda says we're proof that family isn't just biology or legal papers, it's the people who refuse to let you disappear. She's right. Chloe's 16 now, thinking about colleges. Ethan's 13 and plays baseball like our dad used to. They're good kids who deserve to grow up together, who deserved someone to fight for them when the system treated them like inconvenient puzzle pieces that didn't fit together. The Morgans wanted to isolate me, to make me forget my siblings and become their perfect adopted son. They thought they could control every aspect of my life, monitor every conversation, manufacture my reality until I accepted their version of family. They didn't count on a $30 burner phone and a kid who refused to forget where he came from. Sometimes that's all it takes to beat the people trying to destroy you. A hidden phone, a secret conversation, and the stubborn refusal to let anyone rewrite your story. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.